Welcome to Revolution and Ideology. We are picking up right where we left off after the historical context video about the Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya during the 1940s and 50s. In this section here, we're going to be discussing specifically the birth of the Mau Mau resistance movement for Ithaca na Waiathi. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. Mau Mau oathing, again, in terms of resistance to the British, began in 1943, and it was mostly done by the Kikuyu peoples that had been removed and placed on reserves by the British white settlers. And again, this was all done wildly violently, also through various forms of legislation. But of course, that legislation, we would argue, is illegitimate as it was colonial. The oathing sought to bring the Kikuyu back to their Kenyan identity through practice, ritual, beliefs, eschewing the assimilation of their oppressor, i.e. the British, while also mirroring their violent tactics. It created a new solidarity and morally bound these individuals during hard times. Some might argue that it was a bit ethnocentric and perhaps used some nationalist ideology, but again, these were the tactics that had been socialized into the system by the British colonial process dating all the way back to the late 1800s, as was discussed in the historical context video. The Kikuyu at this point had also seen the failure of playing the games as set, or playing by the rules of the games as set by their white oppressors. So in other words, using political parties or labor organization that was allowed in certain parts of Kenya, especially for other groups besides the Kikuyu, was not working for them. So they decided that they needed to form an actual revolutionary movement. A lot of this was put together through propaganda. A popular writer named Gakara Wawanju began writing about Kikuyu glory, resistance, beliefs, went back into like the mythos of what it meant to be a Kikuyu warrior, and he eventually caused enough of a stir that the British labeled him as a subversive. He's eventually banned by the British colonial leaders. Some of his more important works include the Creed of Kikuyu and Mumbi. We highly recommend you check that out. You can find it in PDF files just through a quick Google search if you're a little bit curious about the writings of Gakara Wawanju. But what it did is it galvanized the movement quite a bit. Propaganda, of course, is necessary for all revolutionary or social movements. The ceremonies in terms of oathing, these are what really scared the British colonial powers. Not just the ones in Kenya, but of course, when news made it all the way back to England itself, there was, again, almost mass hysteria that these oathing ceremonies were taking place. The ceremonies mixed the power of the ideal and material symbolism of what it meant to be a Kikuyu, both historically and in terms of the current resistance movement. And again, it bound these individuals in solidarity, belief, practice, importantly, tactics, and again, identity. To briefly describe the process of oathing, or at least most of the processes of oathing, obviously it evolved over the years from the late 1940s through the mid-1950s, but in sum, essentially it worked as a individual would pass through a banana leaf arch. They would be stripped naked, especially if they were wearing colonial clothing. It was meant to like remove their colonial identity under the British and to be reborn as a Kikuyu. They usually had a goat sacrifice. That goat sacrifice was eaten after the affirmative acceptance of the individual into the Mau Mau movement. They were then given an in-depth history lesson of what it meant to be a Kikuyu, again, dating all the way back to like their creation narratives, and essentially how that more or less rationalized the violence that was going to take place against their colonial power, not just against the colonial powers, but other Kenyans that were used in the process of their oppression. So here is an example of one of the oaths that would be spoken. I speak the truth and vow before God, and before this movement, the movement of unity, the unity which is put to the test, the unity that is mocked with the name of Mau Mau, that I shall go forward to fight for the lands of Kirinyaga that we cultivated, the lands which were taken by the Europeans, and if I fail to do this, may this oath kill me. May this seven kill me. May this meat kill me. And again, this is just one example of the oaths, but it was one of the more popular examples that was used quite often. These oaths swore the individual, the oath taker, to protect the Kiama, the Kikuyu Kiama, which essentially means the Mau Mau Council, for lack of a better English term. There were 7 levels of oathing that were progressively created as the Mau Mau garnered clout. These 7 levels eventually created more and more commitment as you kind of worked your way up into each level. The ultimate level would be the 7th level, known as the Batuni, which basically, when you take that oath, you are binding yourself to basically be willing to kill for the Mau Mau movement, for liberation of not just the Kikuyu people, but of Kenya from England. Importantly, oathing distinguished the true freedom fighter Mau Mau from the Kikuyu that were willing to sell out their own people, often called loyalists. These loyalists were often given material rewards like land or cattle to basically, again, work against, if not sometimes actively, like torture their fellow Kenyans. The practical meanings of oathing evolved over time, but also left space for individuals to interpret their own place within the rebellion. It was a rejection of the colonial named chiefs. It was a reclamation of land that was sought. It ended forced labor, or sought to end forced labor. It basically envisioned a Kenya for Kenyans. There was beauty in this ambiguity. And again, each individual could place their own values within the ambiguity or the vague notion of these 7 layers of resistance that the Mau Mau would basically accept through the process. Oathing garnered attention all the way back in the UK as early as 1950. And the only way that the colonial officials could envision reacting to this oathing process was through militant violence. Diplomacy was not going to work. They thought that they needed to, of course, squash this movement before it became too big. The tactics of the Mau Mau themselves were relatively simple. Basically, they were going to create... they were going to fight a guerrilla war. There was also going to be targeted assassinations. At first, the targeted assassinations were not the colonizer; they were the loyalists. And one of the most famous examples took place in 1952 when Chief Waruhiu was assassinated in his car. There was also destruction of settler property, and eventually, of course, later settlers too. So there would be mass slaughter of their livestock, burning of crops. These things were meant to hit their oppressor, i.e., the colonial British citizens, in the wallet. There were also violent land seizures, and there was land reclamation by the Mau Mau freedom fighters. Guerrilla warfare took place only once the colonial government had been goaded into combat, and a more militant, formalized wing of the Mau Mau would form, known as the KLFA, the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army, and it was led by an individual named Dedan Kimathi. In his words, he says, "The white settlers are like a drop in the ocean among the masses of the Kenyan people, and no matter what they do, they will never govern this country without our consent. Our primary aim is to dismantle their evil machinery, whatever the cost. What we have to do is to unite and organize ourselves for a long struggle until we drive them from our country." This army was well organized. It was swift. They engaged in brief, efficient attacks, and most often used silent weapons, and of course at night. This was guerrilla warfare. There were a few later mass attacks that took place. One of the unsavory examples would be the Lari massacre, which we'll talk about in a future video. Their role, the KLFA's role, evolved after the war and during the concentration process, which we will again talk about in a future video. There was also a lot of non-militant help from basically villages that would help the Mau Mau in terms of supply lines, getting information. They would also steal ammunition from the colonial powers. And there was also an information war that the KLFA would engage in. They would actually get village kids to basically play games around British soldiers, and while they were playing these games, these kids would essentially listen to what the British soldiers were talking about for intel, and then transmit this information to the Mau Mau freedom fighters that were, of course, off in the mountains around Mount Kenya. Tactically and methodologically speaking, this was a wildly important set of tactics to make sure that the Mau Mau and the KLFA were always one step ahead of the British colonial powers. Eventually, this is going to lead to what the British would call an emergency, and that emergency is what we're going to be talking about in the next video.